welcome to another episode of Reinventing School. And this episode continues some of the questions and some of the interviews that we've been asking within the world of positive education, positive psychology, the intersection of those ideas with social emotional learning and with mindfulness and a whole bunch of other things that we'll get into. So I'm absolutely thrilled. We're recording this a little bit off schedule because in Australia it's the morning and here we are and it's the evening, which is always a bit confusing. But we have one guest today and her name is Lea Waters. And we met, about a year and a half ago because we're both in that positive psychology world. And I have all sorts of questions, but let me just kind of set things up a little bit. You are in Melbourne, but you seem very much the global citizen and the global educator. So can you kind of give us a taste of what you're up to and how, and kind of how it came about?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Well, it's great to see you again, Howard. And yeah, you're right. I'm based in Melbourne. I'm work at the University of Melbourne here in Australia, but have done a lot of work in schools for more than a decade now, really, as you say, internationally across the world. So work across Europe, the UK, United Arab Emirates, Hong Kong, Asia, and North America, Mexico, Canada, the US. Around this sort of topic of positive education and how it is that we can interlink learning and well-being so that our students are graduating with the sort of full skill set that's going to help them have positive and productive lives. I got into the area. I've been a psychologist for 27 years, and actually my PhD was in organizational psychology. So this February marks 25 years as a researcher at the University of Melbourne. And the first sort of half of those 25 years were in the business school, having done a PhD, working in corporates and organizations as a psychologist, around the topic of leadership and employee well-being, employee mental health. And then my son is 17 now. So when he was quite young, I sort of had one of those light bulb moments sitting on my couch on a Friday night with takeout food, watching a rerun of Monk with my husband, and I was like, well, I'm doing all of this work with very senior executives all across the world, coaching them around this new field of positive psychology and how it is that we take a strength-based approach and how it is that we can engage in some of these mental health skills and strategies to help us, in the case of these companies, to help those people be better leaders, to help create collegiality, good culture across the organization, and to help the organization be more productive. And time again, in working with these organizations, I would have these, like I said, very senior leaders come up and say, I've been working in this field for 30 plus years. Why hasn't anyone provided me with this skill set until now? Why did it have to take until I got to the top of the ladder and was under enormous amounts of stress and pressure for me to learn these skills? And so that was kind of ruminating in my head, this very, very sort of consistent question I'd had for over a decade in working in businesses and corporates. And at that time, my son Nicholas was quite young, and I was teaching him a lot of those skills just informally as a parent at home. And then he started his kindergarten when he was 4 years old. And so I offered to work with the kindergarten teacher for free, just to say, look, I think there's some things that we can teach these kids. So why wait until someone's 40? Like, why not start when they're 4 and really have that early intervention approach? Because the thing about well-being is, yes, it's an outcome. Our mental health is a state, but it's also a skill set. And in the same way that we teach reading and writing and arithmetic, we teach those 3 R's. Why not add a 4th R and teach resilience? Because it is something that we can teach. We can break it down into knowledge and mindsets and skills, and we can teach that. And I was teaching that to people in their sort of senior career who have fixed mindsets, and have been around for a long time. Why not start with a young mind? And so that's kind of how I wove from being an organizational psychologist and working in businesses to then committing myself to work with schools. And then from there, setting up this particular program that I have called Visible Wellbeing. And like I said, that's now in 7 countries across the world. So really have had an exciting journey in this field.
So I'll share with you that in my years as a senior executive, somebody handed me a little 2-column chart that compared CEOs and infants, and they were remarkable.
Yes. Yeah, that's hilarious. And um, the thing is that we develop in the ways that based on the opportunities that we're given, based on the messages that we're given, based on formal education, and then based on the relationships that we have. And so there are parts of us as grown-up adults that are quite underdeveloped. So I can see where you would find that sort of like, here's the 2-year-old having the tantrum and here's the CEO. Because brain development is based on kind of the messages and the environment that we're in. And so, like I said, we can be grown-ups and be underdeveloped, or we can be little kids who are actually quite wise.
Yeah, and coming from the television industry as I do, I saw people, who had a lot of years on them, but were pretty childish, and I'm sure I was from time to time as well. So
Mm.
here's the question that I've been struggling with: is the teaching, and I'm reluctant to use the word teaching, but is the learning of resilience and all of the various skills and the toolkit and the techniques and all that
Yeah.
go with positive learning, if you will. Um, is that something that is a course of study, the way social studies or science or math would be?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Something that is a tool, the way a pencil or a Chromebook would be?
mm-hmm.
State of mind, or is it pretty much just stop beating up your sister, leave her alone, stop teasing her? Right? Where does it fit in? Because I know that educators often struggle with, well, I don't know what to do with this. I think it's important, but it doesn't line up. It's one of one of these things is not like the others, and
Yeah.
one feels very much like it's not like the others.
I love that question, and it's such a beautiful question to ask, because I do think that it can be a bit of a barrier how it is that we bring well-being into the culture of a school. Because typically what has happened is that well-being, and I'm just gonna use well-being education as the broad umbrella term, right? So people have turf wars about positive education versus social emotional learning versus resilience versus mindfulness versus a random acts of kindness school. To me, I think let's kind of step up and look at the bigger picture. And this is all broad umbrella wellbeing education. And wellbeing education traditionally has been introduced to schools through a program, through a student curriculum. And what that means immediately is, the one of the most contested resources within a school is the timetable. And timetables are overly structured, and particularly when you get up to those senior years where there's a sort of national curriculum that many countries have to teach, and the senior school teachers are under a lot of pressure to deliver a volume of curriculum. So because wellbeing was often introduced as a program, it immediately bumps up against a barrier of, where do we fit this into the timetable? And that's when you have those teachers saying, I really want to do this. I'm not sure where it fits, because we're trying to sort of squeeze something in. And what happens is that, and I have nothing against programs or curriculums. I think that they're great. They're dedicated lesson plans that take students through a sequence of learning, but you have to find room for them in the timetable. So what happens is that it becomes the responsibility of one or two of those really keen teachers who go out and do the professional learning and then come back into the school, and then it's their kind of responsibility, and then they might teach it on a Tuesday in period 5. So it becomes this boundaried experience, both for the students themselves and for the teachers. Only a certain number of teachers do it, and the rest of the teachers kind of get given the manual, but they're really not sure, well, where would I fit this in? How do I do this? And so the work that I've been doing over the last 10 years is really encouraging schools to shift mindset and move from well-being being a programmatic approach to well-being, to taking this practice-oriented approach. And it was really interesting for me, Howard, because, as I said, I came from the corporate world doing a lot of work with employee well-being and leadership and kind of team dynamics. And then had this light bulb moment where I was like, I want to give this to young people. And so I started working with schools. And even I didn't realize, it took me a couple of years to realize, I started working with schools, and this mentality of we bring wellbeing in through a program is so deeply ingrained in schools that even I didn't see what was happening. It took me about 5 years till I realized, hang on, I didn't ever introduce a program. When I worked in the corporate world, I didn't say, we'll train 2 people and then they'll come back, and Tuesday at 3:00, everyone stops what they're doing and they do well-being. Like, that's not how it works. How it works in business in the corporate world is, in the best scenario, is you build up the skills, the knowledge, the capability of the whole team. And then they find these natural organic moments where it's useful to, step back as a team and have a look at, have we gone into a pessimistic mindset here, and we've just lost a client? What is the kind of psychological skill set that we should be doing to kind of bounce back, bounce forward, regroup ourselves, move forward? Or it's someone's birthday, how would we celebrate that? Or we can see a team member's not doing so well, what are some things we can do? Or as a CEO or the team leader, Friday afternoon, we've just sort of landed the pitch, we're really tired, does someone want to lead a 5-minute mindfulness before we have our team debrief at the end of the week? So when you shift from it being a program that you have to fit into the timetable to being a set of flexible practices, then all of a sudden you find that math teacher going, oh, okay, I could start the class with just a centering activity. Or I can see that there's a student who's really struggling, who's got this fixed mindset around math. So this is a little moment where I can just have a 1-minute conversation with them about their mindset and kind of loosening up their mind and taking them back to the fact that last week that they did that problem really, really well. So what was the difference in their mindset between then and now? So when you have it as this practice idea rather than a program, it just instantly opens up this flexibility, and it allows teachers to pick the different sort of positive education practices and topics that resonate with them, that suit their particular curriculum, that suit their teaching style. And it means that all of the teachers in the school have this skill set. And that's such a big thing, I think, is that we can't just be delivering wellbeing education for the young people in the school. It has to equally be about the adults in the school and equipping them with their own resources. I'll stop there because I feel like I'm talking a lot.
Well, no, it's useful, but I have a third level that I want to ask you about. So if there's a program and there's a practice,
Yeah.
The practice still feels very teachable moment. It feels very, how do I find a situation that I can use to be able to explain what this is about? And I don't think that either of them, at least in my head, makes sense, because I think there's a higher level, which is establishing a way of working and thinking and treating others and dealing with your own problems and dealing with other people's problems. And coming at this both from a corporate executive point of view and a team leader, but also spending a lot of time building and running television production operations. So I've got 150 people that I have to all do the same thing so that we laugh at just the right moment, right? And you don't do that with teachable moments. You do that by establishing a feeling in the studio, allowing everybody to speak up, and also having everybody understand that there's a moment in time where everybody can't speak up because the host has to do the job. And we have to support that person in any way we can. And then we all sort of fall back. But the natural ebb and flow of our all working together intensely in one large room with a fair amount of heat, right, and a fair amount of electronics and all that. So you don't want to trip on a cable. You're very aware of where you are. And you also consider yourself very fortunate for being there because you know how many other people would like to be. So it's sort of a precious job, right?
Yeah.
So in some ways, being in school and being a teacher would seem equally precious or more so. I mean, we're doing jokes for a cartoon mouse. A teacher is actually accomplishing something. So if you're in that position, do you do this as a class? Do you do it not at all? Do you do it as the principal? Is this a school district thing, or does the state superintendent go, no, we're all going to do well-being now, which seems highly improbable to me? So my construct, because it sounds very reasonable to me, but I'm listening to me. How about I listen to you? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I love what you're saying, because what's important is there's multiple access points to infusing a system with well-being. And one of them is the program. One of them is a series of practices, and the other, what I'm hearing you say, is that it gets built into the DNA of the culture of the workplace, in this case, a school. And again, I think that there's a couple of ways of doing that. And when as an organizational psychologist, what I was trained to do in creating cultural change is sort of top down, bottom up, and then you squeeze from the sides. So I think the bottom up is the program, and the kind of introducing things from the sides is the range of practices that are sort of flexible. And then you do have to have that sort of top down, which really is about the leaders of a system or a school building into their strategic mission and their strategic plan well-being of some sort, and saying that, what is the purpose of a school, really? And that's the biggest question. That's an even bigger question than culture. That's a question of us as a society standing back and saying, well, we've got all these institutions in our society. We have religious institutions, we have workplaces, we have community organizations, we have the institution of family, and we have this institution called school. And what is the purpose of that institution within our society? And
I'm hoping you answer.
Well, I can give a somewhat of an answer, but I think it's actually a really important question that we need to all be stepping back and answering a little. But if you think about schools historically, the way that a school currently, by and large, functions and operates, and every teacher I talk to, and every superintendent I talk to, and every administrator I talk to lives this every day: the frustration of engaging in what is at its core a human endeavor, but doing that within a bureaucratic, constraining structure of an organization. And so schools, the way that schools were formed, the way that they I mean, we're getting more flexibility, so I hope I haven't offended anyone in saying that. But most people will agree that schools are still really much operating on the factory model, on this 20th century model, and that schools were first developed in sort of coming out of the Industrial Revolution, where we had this massive change in the way society was. Am I getting too high level here?
You're not. I think.
Okay. All right. So we had this.
It takes us even further up. So go ahead.
Yeah. So we had this society where people were artists and artisans and craft, and that you pass down your skill as the blacksmith to your son and daughter. And that's the way professions were developed and knowledge and skills were gained. Unless you were fortunate enough to be in the gentry, or you had the opportunity to be educated through a church. Other than that, education of the child really fell within the family and the family system. And individuals worked at home. And then we had the Industrial Revolution, and people put their tools down and they went to work for these large factories. The adults went to work for these large factories. And then it left this kind of problem of like, oh, what do we do with our children who are now at home unsupervised? It's more complicated than that, but that's essentially it. So then schools were developed at that same time to say, all right, well, let's find a way of taking care of mass numbers of children, like mass production of children, and developing their skill set so they can grow up and work in a factory. And so that was sort of the purpose of school, was to develop these skills that allow them to go on and work. And that is still the purpose of schools. It's not so much this kind of linear thing into a factory, but I think that we still rest on that assumption that schools are about developing vocational skills and kind of preparing a young person for their career. And I'm not saying that that's not what school should be about. I have 2 children and I want them to be prepared for a career when they get out of it. But there's kind of this old invisible idea that that is not the reality of most individuals, most teachers, most administrators, school counselors, etc., within the system. If you speak to anyone within the system, they say, no, the purpose of a school is, certainly to allow young people to grow up and be productive, but it's also to allow a young person. The purpose of a school is to create a good citizen. The purpose of a school is to create a young person who grows up, who knows who they are, who's got a good skill set to go on and contribute through their career productively to society, but is also a good person who has good mental health, who contributes in other ways. And so that's where we're sort of seeing this conflict between the way the system is structured and which is very bureaucratic, and the human element that comes within it. And so I think it is a matter of stepping back and saying, what is the purpose more broadly of the institution? And then that flows down into your vision and mission statement. And if you think that the purpose of schools as an institution is to prepare young people to grow up and be healthy, vibrant, productive adults, like to be good citizens, not just a skill set to be able to go and do this particular sort of factory job, if you like. If you think that's the broader purpose of school, then that feeds into the culture of your school. It feeds into your vision and your mission statement. It feeds into your 5-year strategic plan, which then flows down into where you put your resources, how you train your staff, how you develop your timetable. And that's where well-being becomes woven into the DNA of the culture. And so it's not just this forced teacher moment, it's everywhere. And so the young person is learning not just by what they're kind of explicitly told and taught, the taught curriculum. There's also that notion of the court curriculum. They learn about these things because they're embedded in a culture where well-being is prioritized, and teachers demonstrate well-being, and they demonstrate what happens when they're feeling stressed, and the language demonstrates that, and the way the timetable is structured demonstrates that. And we saw that happen through COVID.
So
I mean, go.
the purpose, back to the purpose for a second. So if the purpose of school is to prepare people to be productive members of society, sort of a good general description, I don't know, the most productive thing I can do is to learn the same thing you do. I think the most productive thing I can do is probably to learn what I'm interested in. And that may be different from what you're interested in. Or there may be shades of difference. You and I are both interested in many of the same things, but not all the same things, because we're people. So if you want to affect my well-being and you're running a school, the best thing to do is not to try to teach me, but instead to allow me to learn.
Yes.
So we're in this sort of cross purpose. Now, let me bring the British Empire into this just as a random piece, right?
Why not?
So at some point, many students around the world learned something about the British Empire. For a long time, most of what they learned about the British Empire was very positive. And then gradually it became clear that everything wasn't as terrific as maybe it was being taught. And we have versions of this in the United States with manifest destiny and all these other crazy ideas that somehow were sold to the public as very positive ideas. But if I'm sitting in an American Indian school and I'm learning about manifest destiny, my well-being might not be my first priority. I might be angry, and I'd have every reason to be angry because I'm being taught a lot of stuff that I probably shouldn't be taught, and maybe nobody ought to be taught. So we're dealing here with, it's almost as if you want to have well-being as a structure within a corporation, but you know you make poison gas. Now, school isn't nearly that bad, but some aspects of the curriculum really are that bad. We're really teaching things we shouldn't be teaching, or we're teaching the wrong lesson. Or by the way, how's climate change going in your parts, right? So we have real issues that are significant because we don't address them, and this generation that's in school now is going to have to address them.
Yeah.
There's a severity about this. So let's bring back in our desire, yours and mine, to have well-being shared among students. And so how do you integrate that kind of thinking into a deeply challenged curriculum that we probably need to clean the cupboard and make some space? So I don't have a problem blowing some things up, putting some other things in place, among them well-being. It may be that it's just sort of one piece of a much larger, much more significant whole, and then well-being makes all the sense in the world. But well-being and trying to teach manifest destiny at the same time seems a little strange.
Agree. So it really is about saying, how do you reinvent? I think well-being is not the full answer. You know, well-being is part of a solution. And you said it so beautifully, Howard, because I've seen this a lot. I go into schools and they teach a resilience curriculum within the setting of a like highly pressured, highly aspirational, highly academic culture. And so, you know, here's one of the ironies. A couple of years ago, I was working with a school and they taught growth mindset curriculum. And, you know, 6-lesson curriculum. And this is a very elite private school in Australia, and it's known for its academic grades, and the kids are just under inordinate amounts of pressure. And so they got taught this growth mindset curriculum, and then they got told there was going to be a test on it, and they all freaked out. Like they freaked out, you know. So everything that they learned just got thrown out of the window because the broader culture and structure trumps the individual and what they're learning, those individual skill sets.
We don't use that verb here as much as.
Oh, yes. Yes. I wiped it.
Could say.
Overrides. Yes. Overrides. So we do need to be thinking again about moving away from well-being as sort of a program and something that you teach to, as you are making these decisions and you're throwing everything up into the air, you know, why are we teaching these particular curriculums? When you're evaluating it from a curriculum perspective, when you're evaluating it from like, well, how would I structure the school? How could I change the timetable so that students have more agency to go off and learn by themselves if they want to? Or more importantly, I would say differentiated education, so that some students can do the autonomous self-paced learning and they're not frustrated sitting in a 50-minute session where everyone has to learn at the same pace. So you've got that students at that end, but differentiated learning says, all right, well, let's allow those students to pace ahead and have more individualized choice about what curriculums they choose. And then let's allow these students who actually do need a slower pace and a bit more dedicated, what we would sort of consider to be directive teaching, allow them to have that opportunity as well. And that's all based on the timetable. So if we're going to throw up the timetable and we're going to throw up curriculum, when we decide how those things land, what I would say is that one of the sort of preconditions for determining timetable, length of time, if students can learn from home, if students can do live lessons, if students can Zoom in versus having to be on campus, if students of different ages, I mean, I didn't have a great math ability. So I might be 16, but actually be not in my class, but actually teach math based on ability. So a 16-year-old is in the same class as a 14-year-old, because that's based on where my academic journey is. And it might be that in English, you know, I'm 14, but I'm with the 17-year-olds, because it's based on your actual academic journey rather than this pretty arbitrary thing, which is chronological age, you know. So I think there's a lot that we could throw up and see where it lands, including some of those areas of curriculum that are doing harm. But I think if we were going to do that, there are a couple of kind of core touch points that would help us to make the decision about how do we redesign the curriculum, how do we redesign timetable, how do we redesign the learning journey. And I think at the heart of all of those, one of the key pieces would be student agency.
All right, well, let's talk about that. That's exactly where I was going to go. So there is this concept of rights. Mm-hmm. So we have a right of free speech. We have, but not in a school, only when the teacher allows it. We have a right of assembly. Yeah, but similar, don't be assembling without, right? So somehow the bouquet of rights that is assigned or made available to every citizen ends up having an asterisk next to it for students. Now, I want to be well. I want to feel comfortable. But at least in the United States, and in the research I'm doing, I'm guessing in more places, I'm doing a lot of, typing into Google. But I'm not entirely sure whether, if I come up with something brilliant, whether Google owns that or my parents own that, or the school owns that. But one
Mhm.
thing I can be certain of, I don't own that.
Mm.
Okay. So as we're doing more and more distance learning and more making things and building maker labs and all that, there's some fundamental rights, whether it's the right to be able to get up during the day whenever I want to do something else. No, you must sit there, that makes well-being sort of second on the list.
Mhm.
First, allow me to think on my own. And then we can talk about that. But if you're not going to let me think on my own, it becomes a little hard for me to buy into a well-being curriculum as a student. Like,
Yeah.
first, let's be fair. And
Mm.
then we can talk about everything else. Or am I being obtuse?
No, I think there's so many thoughts running through my head. So I'm going to sort of go in a couple of different directions from that. The first thing I want to say is that there's a lot of schools now, progressive schools, who are not that sort of stereotype that you just presented. They do allow students to be self-paced. They do set up the classrooms and the rooms so that, if you want to get up and go and have a stretch break, or you want to go up and get a drink, or you've decided that actually my brain's a bit fried right now, so I'm not going to continue this academic learning, I'm going to go and do something else. I think, and what sits underneath those schools is sort of at the core of what you're talking about, which is basically throwing out the old power structure and the old power hierarchy. And
Right? I mean, the
so
word
that,
agency.
yes, so I want to say there are definite exceptions to that rule. Then the other thing that I want to say is that you just make a really good point, and this is a bigger form of change and discussions that's needed. And I think it ties back a little to what I was talking about before, about it's not just schools, but many workplaces. You could say what you just said for many workplaces as well, Howard. It does come back to post-industrial revolution and power structures and hierarchy. I mean, bureaucracy, the core aim of bureaucracy was efficiency. And when you talk about efficiency, if that's what you're privileging, if you're privileging efficiency of a product or an outcome, then the humanity behind that gets taken away, because you and I are treated exactly the same. We're the same cog. We have to work at exactly the same time. And so everything that you're talking about, I can think of a lot of workplaces who'd be saying, well, I'm only allowed to have a toilet break at certain times. I have to work to a certain pace. I don't get to choose my hours. If there is a hierarchy, if the boss is talking, I'm not allowed to talk. I'm not allowed to have a difference of opinion. So it's really a bigger question about how we evolve human interactions and human institutions. Maybe we start with schools, because if we do it in schools, then they're the people who graduate and take it to their workplaces. And
One of my favorites, senior executive role. We had a deadline that nobody believed we could possibly meet on a very big project that would affect the fate of a public company.
wow.
And the first all hands meeting, there was a big sheet cake, and on it was the deadline.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody was forced to eat a piece.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And then the company crashed and burned. So, I mean, let's transpose that to, I'm not a kid at a progressive school. I'm a
Yeah.
kid in an ordinary school.
The more standard. Yeah.
Reasonably bright, but I really am in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents aren't wealthy. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to go to college or not. It'll be a stretch. Some kids do, some kids don't. And
Mm-hmm.
that's the big fat middle, right? So
Yeah.
I don't feel that I have particular agency. I fortunately I don't get beaten by my parents, but I have friends who are frightened of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we don't have the mobility. We don't really have the money, and yet I'm told I'm optimistic, but I don't know why. And I have a lot of friends who aren't. And
Mm-hmm.
some of those friends have already turned to drugs, and some of them are bait for gangs and all that. So this is real life. There's bullying, and there's not much we can do about it. And then we introduce this idea of well-being, which of course would most benefit the bully, but how do you get there, right?
Mhm. Mm.
So how do you think about all of this as a holistic system? Because it seems to me that the rights, the choice of curriculum, the choice of being able to learn as you wish, the ability to be able to get up during a class if you feel, I mean, the ability to be able to go take a yoga class if you don't feel like science is your thing this morning.
Mhm.
Those are big leaps. And
Yeah, they're huge.
they're very much where the 21st century seems to be leading as we
Mm.
get to agency, as we get to everybody is unique, as we get to there is so much knowledge being generated and so much of it is so specialized that trying to do this in groups with
Yeah.
it's just I mean all of this sort of falls, and that's a lot of the work that I've been doing is trying to connect these dots.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Really believe in everything you're saying,
Mm.
regardless of whether we're calling it SEL or we're calling it mindfulness or we're calling it any of those other words.
Mm.
And yet I can't figure out how the pieces get put together. Not
Yeah.
for the majority of students on earth, which is what, 1.5 billion kids. It's a
Mhm.
lot of kids.
Mm.
How do we help them? What do we do, you and I, because we both have the opportunity to at least be on a screen with each other and maybe some other people will watch?
It feels like a very overwhelming question. And I think, if I go back to my training as an organizational psychologist, when you think about how do you create organizational change, it's sort of, you have to start with a vision in mind, and you have to start with like, well, what are all the pieces that require change? And then you have to recognize that this is a system. So if we come in and change one piece, just start with one piece. We come in and change one piece, it has flow-on effects to the other piece. So we start with, for example, saying, let's create flexible start times and end times to the day. And students can choose, you might come in, there might be a school day that starts at 7 a.m. and finishes at 2. And then another school day in the same school, another like 2 sort of streams that starts at 10 and finishes at 5. And let's say not only to the students, but to the teachers, based on your lifestyle, based on your circadian rhythm, based on what suits you, you can be in stream A, which is the early stream, or stream B, which is the later stream. I know it's such a small change, but start where you can actually create a little crack in the system, and then start to look at the flow-on effects from there. I'm just being really pragmatic with my answer here to not, so that people aren't feeling overwhelmed. It's so difficult if you work in the public system to even as the superintendent or as the school leader to have the agency to even do something like that. And so I don't know if that's like the greatest answer in the world, but I do know that when you create organizational change, you have to be aware of the component pieces that we want to create change. We know there's a system effect. So we know when you pull one lever, it has a knock-on effect, either positive or negative, to the other parts of the system. But to do it that way, and I've just given a concrete example. The other thing that I do want to say, which you kind of alluded to at the start of your point there, and it's always a tension in psychology. Like, you can do some things that help to create internal change. But if that individual is going back to, say I'm working as a therapist and someone comes to me and I helped them to set boundaries, and I help them to develop their strengths and have a bit more confidence in themselves. And I help them that in those moments of pressure and like high ramped up stress, they can do some deep breathing and a couple of minutes of mindfulness, and it will reset their nervous system and it will reset their physiology. I can do all of those things, but if they go back to a toxic workplace or a brutal marriage, you can only do so much until you change the broader situation. So we do need to be having these big picture conversations. Having said that, I've had one of my PhD students just graduated last year, and he took on the challenge of looking at the application of positive education with students who are affected by trauma. And within 2 particular, we call them special schools here in Australia. So they're schools that are part of a system for for kids who can no longer be in mainstream school because they've been so deeply affected by trauma. And so these two particular schools, 90% of the kids are in the foster system. Some of the kids are actually in juvenile justice. They're in prison. So they leave prison for the day to go to school, and then they go back to prison. So we're talking really, really like the kind of thin edge of the wedge, you know, with these young kids who are living in really difficult circumstances, high levels of alcoholism in their families, violence, drug addiction. And, you know, we couldn't change that for the kids, for those students, but what we could do was give them an inner capacity to be able to more clearly see their situation, so there was less self-blame and self-loathing and something wrong and I'm broken. And then just to give them some really practical skills to be able to better manage. So we couldn't change their broader environment that was causing that was causing the trauma and the damage, but we could just do those little shifts inside of them that helps them to better manage and understand. And the nudge theory always appeals to me, you know, the idea that you create just a little change in someone, and that little change, you know, instead of them then having this trajectory, if you work with them here and you create this little change, it changes their trajectory over time. And, you know, in my own journey, one of the reasons why I became a psychologist is because I grew up with very significant abuse in my family and suffered eating disorders and anxiety as a teenager, was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder in my early 20s as a result of the violence and chaos of my family. Overcame the eating disorder and PTSD through therapy, and then had sort of a decade of anxiety. I mean, I was high functioning. I was doing a PhD and working at the University of Melbourne and doing all these things, but lived that journey as a result of abusive parents. And I can tell you, and it's anecdotal, but I can tell you that, and I never shared what was going on at school with anyone, but I had a humanities teacher who I think just had tuned in. And so we're talking the 80s, late 80s. I graduated in 1988, so kind of like mid to late 80s. And she happened to be my humanities teacher. And she would run a weekly meditation session. Back then it wasn't called mindfulness, it was meditation. And of course, mindfulness is just one part of a whole lot of different meditation techniques. But anyway, so she would run this meditation session and she would just invite people along. And she would really, each week she would say, "Are you coming on Thursday at lunchtime, Lee?" And I'd say, "Yes, miss, you know, I'm coming on Thursday at lunchtime." And she didn't change what was happening for me at home. But she provided me with 30 minutes once a week of some mental stillness and a space to escape that emotional turmoil. And she provided me with a skill set. And I still use those techniques that she taught me as a 15, 16, 17-year-old. I still use them today as a 49-year-old. And I taught those techniques to my kids as they were growing up. So sometimes we can't change the broader situation, but we can provide a sense of internal direction and strength for a young person that helps them to better cope. And hopefully over time, it changes their trajectory and they grow up and they rise above.
But shouldn't school be that safe place, that
Yes.
place?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, in the community. Yes, in that life. Yes, all of that. But when I come into the school building, I should be there to learn.
You cannot have well-being if you don't have the precondition of safety. It's just as simple as that.
So,
and you cannot learn if you don't have the precondition of safety. And I really I don't see well-being as learning as two separate endeavors. The two are intimately interlinked. And if I'm feeling good, I'll learn more effectively. And when I'm learning more effectively, it makes me feel good about myself. And the neuroscientists show that now, you know, the areas of the brain that process sort of intellectual cognitive material in our frontal lobe are all interconnected with the frontal lobe processing our positive and negative emotions, the more complex emotions. So our primal emotions are sort of processed deep in our brain, in our limbic system. But any more complex emotion, which is the bulk of our emotions, so joy, optimism, gratitude, envy, they're called complex emotions because you have to actually think about them. So rage, I don't have to think about. Fear, I don't have to think about. Like, it just happens instantly and happens in my limbic system. But for me to have gratitude, the emotion of gratitude, I have to think about that and say, oh, aren't I lucky that I get this opportunity or I have this experience? For me to have joy, it's a perspective taking emotion. I'm like, wow, that's amazing that I'm sitting on the top of a, cliff and watching this beautiful sunset. For me to have envy or jealousy, that's a complex emotion. I have to, so learning this cognitive endeavor from a purely biological perspective, the areas of the brain that light up when I learn a math problem are intertwined with the areas of the brain that light up for all of these emotions. And so I'm sort of getting a little off point, but I think learning and well-being are the same. And I don't think you can have they're intertwined, and you cannot have either if you don't have the precondition of safety in your school.
So 2 points come up there. One of them is, shouldn't every first grader look at some scans of their brain to see what happens? So because they're fascinated by what's happening, we all are.
Yes.
But be able to say, you see, when you were learning this, that's what happened. And when you were afraid, that's what happened.
Yeah.
So why isn't there a scanner in every school? Why isn't there?
I would love to see that, and it actually raises the other question, which is, we don't teach kids about their brain.
Why not?
Like, well, we teach them to use their brain to learn, math or as Shakespeare sonnet, but we don't teach them how their brain actually works. Like, well, shouldn't that be one? And look, again, that's starting to happen. So there are certain programs out there now that are teaching kids about their brain anatomy and about what happens when they're learning and what happens when they're feeling fearful. And and my kids went to a school that learned all that. So I had my little daughter, she's 13 now, but she was going to be doing a music concert when she was in 5th grade, and she was super nervous. And she said, "It's okay, Mum. It's just my amygdala. Like, my amygdala is just making me feel fearful." And she calmed herself down because she had that knowledge. And I was like, "Oh my God,
So
awesome!"
seems to me that, I mean, if we were going to play around with reorganizing the curriculum in some way, it would seem to me that and your body ought to be pretty close to the top of the list, and that
Yes.
anything resembling social studies really wouldn't be anywhere near that high. But there's resistance to this. There, you walk into a school and you feel the resistance in most schools. Now, part of that is, I'm a ninth grader packed in an intense environment with lots of other ninth graders. I don't know who ever thought that was a good idea.
No.
Psychodrama.
Factory model.
Gail, are you kidding? Could you come up with a worse idea than that? So there is that awfulness, and then we exacerbate it with social media and all that. But again, if school is to be a safe place,
Yeah.
what do you mean by safe place? And I'm asking that in part because we're going to be doing an episode about school as a safe place. And I started doing some research to figure out what makes school an unsafe place. It's a community an unsafe place. So I immediately went to, well, I could die. That would be a pretty good indication of danger. What are the most likely causes of death among people who are up to 18 years old? And I was surprised that I had no idea what the answer was. And as I've run around with other adults asking educators, they didn't have any idea what the answer was either. So what's the largest, this is in the United States, so what's the largest cause of death for people who are less than 18 years old?
Well, sadly, I would say death by suicide.
Nope.
Accident.
Car accidents.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say car accident or accident more generally.
And if you're under, let's say 5, 6, 7.
Drowning.
Yeah. Suffocation, drowning, poisoning. So if those are the dangers, that's good, because we deal with cars, right? But there's a difference. And this was one of the guests we'll have on. It talked about, you can't really look at death because there aren't that many kids who die,
Yeah,
right?
I would. So there's sort of more, there's safety in terms of mortality, but I'd be talking more safety in terms of psychological safety and social safety. And, how it is that if a young person doesn't feel socially safe or psychologically safe, their brain is going to be in fight or flight mode. They can't activate their frontal lobe to engage in the higher purpose of learning.
So there is this ridiculous jigsaw puzzle of SEL and all these other ideas.
Mm.
And if I'm a teacher, I really want to do the right thing. I'd like to be able to at least establish an environment in my classroom, and maybe I can get a few other teachers to do the same thing. So maybe we're going to meditate a little bit, or maybe we're going to teach the kids yoga, or maybe we're going to identify moments when they could be behaving differently or whatever, teachable moments. And I'm as confused as I can be about what mindfulness is, what SEL is, what positive education, which seems to be different from positive psychology, but they seem closely related. Is there, and those seem to be the three biggies, and there's a whole lot of others. So
Mm-hmm.
are those essentially different ways of saying the same thing? Or are they each sort of equally spicy and I should throw them all into the dish? Like what's going on here? Help me sort this out simply.
Hmm. For me, they're all trying to achieve the same purpose in slightly different ways. So I see it as a bit of a Venn diagram, so you've got social emotional learning, and there's a little bit of an overlap with resilience education, and then there's a little bit of an overlap with positive education and mindfulness education, but they're all kind of different ways of achieving the same thing, which is saying that we're going to both formally teach well-being skills, as well as use these different areas to create the broader cultural environments that allow for the experience of well-being. And when I say that, I'm not just saying the experience of well-being is that we all have to sit there and be happy. It's actually saying, like, in this moment, I'm feeling really frustrated. I'm feeling self-doubt because I can't figure out this, or I'm feeling left out socially. So that's making me feel this sense of kind of, psychological fear that I'm not part of the tribe anymore. So there's the specific teaching of the skills and the practices. Yes, I think the biggest impact is actually creating an environment that recognizes that people's emotions flux and change, and just sort of that basic knowledge that when I go in and I work with schools, you've sort of got a quadrant of teachers who just do it naturally. So they just know, like, this is just good teaching. You smile at your kids, you engage with your kids, you know each of the children, you crack a joke, you pause when you can see that there's a little moment of tension or frustration or energy levels are low. You give them, within the constraints of the education system, you give them choice. So you've always got that group. And they always come up to me afterwards and they're like, thank you for, like, articulating and making clear that what we do is not just being this soft teacher, that there's actually there's a neurochemistry behind what we do. And so when we do these things, we're allowing better learning. It's not just because we're, the soft hippie teacher. Then there's another quadrant down the other end who are like, that is not my job. I teach this particular curriculum. I don't want to be involved in any of this stuff. And then you've got a large percentage of teachers in the middle, as you say, who want to do it, but are a little bit confused and overwhelmed. And for me, even though I'm a researcher, it just always comes down to pragmatics. What is your, what makes you feel good about your job? At the end of the day, what do you want to be known for as a teacher? What's your particular teaching style? So if you want to do mindfulness, because that suits you, do that. If you prefer to look at, like, explanatory styles and do more of that sort of cognitive stuff, do that. If you want to do more of the yoga, and I totally agree with you, Howard, your point before about, and again, this is sort of going back to, Descartes and sort of and philosophy and the distinction between the mind and the body being separate. And we don't teach our kids how to tune into their body. That's a big part of what I do with visible well-being. It's based on the science of interoception. And so interoception is internal, perception of what's happening internally. And if we learn, our body communicates with us all the time. Your body is this beautiful vehicle that's constantly walking around. If you know how to listen to it, it's constantly telling you about your state of well-being. It doesn't communicate in words, but it communicates in terms of sensations of pressure and temperature and fatigue levels. And it's constantly telling you, like you sit down to answer an email and you see particular person's name coming into the inbox, and your body goes straight away, like into this. It's like yelling at you, Lee, be careful, be careful, be careful, be careful. Or, you read an email from a good friend and your body goes, and you have a little bit of a sort of silent chuckle to yourself. So we do need to be teaching kids about their mind. We do need to be teaching kids about their body. But the point I was making with that is that I don't think we can't get caught up in divisions. This is positive education versus mindfulness versus resilience education versus social and emotional learning. I think it's actually about saying to the teachers, here's a menu. And if we step out of that programmatic approach, from this menu, choose the things that feel authentic to you. Choose the things that feel doable to you. And you don't have to solve the world. If you do your little bit of the well-being puzzle, and another teacher in your school chooses a different little bit of the well-being puzzle, and so the kids in year 8 learn about their explanatory style. By the time they get to year 11, they've learned about their character strengths and they've learned about engaging in some mindfulness practices. They graduate from school with this toolkit. So it's not just 1 year level, Tuesday, period 5.
And yet, I don't know that it's the teachers. So 2 points. One, reflecting on my various teachers over a lot of years, boy, a lot of them could benefit from spending some time with you. Okay. I mean, just like the word evil comes up a bunch. Nightmares come up a bunch, right?
Yeah, it's so sad, isn't it?
I think
you ask anyone, so many people of like my generation or above have horror stories about particular teachers.
So,
and I do too. And I was a good student, but there's particular teachers who just use that power and control to break me apart.
Yep.
And it's so sad and it's so damaging.
So we have that. So we have a teacher issue, but we also have the benefit of, in a typical school, there are only X number of teachers, but Y, the number of students, is much larger. Turns out that they end up being pretty good teachers on their own, because if you have a friend who, or you have somebody who doesn't like you, who sometimes you're learning more from the person who you're not getting along with, right? So being involved and watching other people behave, and I'm going to come back to the production experience. So I don't think anything in my high school career had as much impact on me as doing 2 staged musicals. And I'm a terrible singer and I'm a terrible dancer, but I'm a pretty good producer, and there's other things I know how to do. But being in that environment where everybody was so supportive because we all had a common goal and we all wanted the show to be good, right? And you do this over and over and over again in shows. Shows are a particular beast. They're very hard to do. They require a lot of talent and a lot of concentration, and they involve a lot of disappointment. And it's one of those experiences where if everybody is not at their best, it pulls everything down, but it's a moment in time. It's a bit like sports, but
yes, I was going to say, yeah,
stars. You're not reliant upon a very small number of people. Everybody has to do it and do it well. So you feel good about it. And part of the reason you do is because unlike sports where it's in a stadium or it's in that audience is right there. And they laughed when you hoped they would laugh.
Yeah.
Everybody worked together to get that laugh.
Yes.
And that experience taught me so much, not only about how to do shows, but how to interact with people, because it created this short-term, very specific kind of hot box.
Yep.
And I whenever anybody asks me, like, okay, so you learned, and what should I try to get out of high school? Say, go in a show, be in a show, bigger the better. And
Yes.
you do just be there for.
Anything co-curricular, I think, and that's why schools have those. So many schools have co-curricular. They have their sports teams, and they have their debating teams, and they have their computer club, and they have their shows, and they have their knitting club, or they're like kind of raising money for some kind of charity or service, or to protect an animal. Like these are all built into schools because there is a recognition that there is so much that we can learn from a well-being perspective, and from social group dynamics, and learning how to fail and get back up again, and learning how to forgive someone if they deliver the wrong line at the wrong time, or they pass the ball in the wrong direction. All these kind of broader life skills come through those experiences through co-curricular, and then also through project-based learning. So that's become quite a big movement in schools now, is the idea of project-based learning. And so you get together with a team around a certain project, and within a small bubble, it builds in a lot of the things that you and I have been talking about, Howard, in terms of kind of agency and being self-paced and being proactive and figuring out group dynamics and dealing with adversity and failure and challenge, but rising up again.
But it's contained.
Yes, they're all contained.
Actually, there's two things that make the extracurriculars different from the school experience. One, I choose to be there.
Yes.
Right. It's self-selecting. And the other is I'm doing it because it matters to me. It doesn't matter to somebody else being there. It matters to me.
Yes.
So it's also in a small contained space of time and all that, right? Space and time. So it doesn't feel boundless. It feels as though I have control over this. When I go into school, I don't have, it goes back to the rights and I have to sit down and do all that stuff. So it's peculiar because we put most of the money and most of the time and most of the energy into the school program. And for me, and probably for a lot of other people, the greatest value is in the extracurricular, the non-school program. And when I go, because I go around the world, I interview kids, they talk a lot about school, but their eyes shine when they talk about things they want to do. So in some ways, I wonder whether the key to this whole concept of well-being is to provide agency, to not have it be something that's afar, but something that's so present and so much a part of their school life. And I wonder about the resistance, and then I wonder why the resistance if we're entering an era or in an era when it is so challenging to solve these giant problems. The best brains on all of this. And the best way I can think of to do that is to give kids the space to become who they are, not to go back to a Prussian army model or an industrial revolution model. It seems to me with so much we need to know. Enabling everybody to do that in the best possible way in a safe environment just seems reasonable, and the other doesn't. And the deeper I get into writing about this, the more confused I am about, well, then why would you want to do it the way, just the status quo, really?
Yeah, it's I think most people within the system want the change to occur.
I agree.
It's such a monolithic task. And again, I'm going back to my training as an organizational psychologist. And so, when you're creating organizational change, I was taught sort of, it's a very simple model to look at what are the sources of resistance to change. And in this particular model, there's kind of three sources of resistance, which are called process resistance, personal resistance, and philosophical resistance. So philosophical resistance would be, no, schools need to be, kids need to learn in these windows at the same time, at the same age group. And it doesn't matter if they don't want to learn these particular subjects, they need to, because it's a bigger purpose. It's a bigger thing of them learning, even to endure topics you don't like, whatever it happens to be. So I don't think there's much philosophical resistance. And it may be the circles that I'm mixing with. But like you, Howard, I see a lot of people across the world, and everyone wants the school system to change. And everyone does have that philosophy that schools as an institution in our society could do so much more for young people.
So check, philosophical.
Yes.
Not a problem.
Personal resistance. happens in pockets. So there are certain, I think there's more people within the system, teachers, school counselors, administrators, superintendents, who want the change to occur and who are prepared to put in the effort to create the change. They're the ones that you're seeing who are saying, I want to do it, I just don't know how. I don't know how I fit all of this in, and I don't know which particular area that I should do. And then even if I do, how do I do it and where do I fit it in? So, I mean, there is definitely some personal resistance. And I guess if I would put a figure on it, just based on my experience with school, it's smaller than you think. I think there's probably about maybe 15 to 20% of people within who want things to remain the way they are.
My number was 20. So I guess pretty close to what you were going. And the third?
Yeah. Okay. So we're sort of getting similar read on the situation. I think the biggest form of resistance is process resistance. And so when you're going to create a change in an organization, if you've got philosophical support and you've got support with the people within, then one of the things that often stops change from occurring is the built-in processes of an institution or a school or an organization. And so this is where we come back to, okay, what are the processes in a school? Timetables, a top-down public system, a heavy curriculum, professional development or professional expectations, discipline policies, some really, really just basic false assumptions that 50 minutes is the best pocket of time to learn in, that 8:30 in the morning till 3:30 in the afternoon is the best pocket of time to learn in, that that if kids don't learn this particular like algorithm equation, it's somehow going to prevent them from having a successful life. So we have to go back to those core assumptions and then say, if we throw out some of those core assumptions, we can actually change some of these processes that are our sticking point at the moment.
Well, that's good news because, I mean, looking at it from an organizational point of view, if there are strong philosophical pushback, very difficult to get any change happening. Will stick. Yes. If there's people resistance, big problem. Process resistance is pretty, of the three of them, that's the one that you can manage your way through.
Agreed.
Get to
once people become clear of it, because what happens is people get really puzzled about why can't we create this change, and they're not stepping back and having a look at what are the sources of resistance. And then when they understand it's process resistance, it's more technical, so it is easier to change, except that we're dealing with this monolith. So you're changing processes within this sort of monolithic thing called the education sector. Can be difficult. That's where I think just start with what you can do and start in your own school and make some small changes. And what I've seen happen, Howard, is when we go in and we do change some of the processes of a school, that with that 20% of people who are resisting, sometimes they're just resisting because they can't conceptualize. It's always been this way, so you can't, and they're tired. Teachers, God bless teachers. I mean, they do so much, and they have change fatigue all of the time. And so some of the resistance in that 20% is not because they don't want to be able to create a culture of well-being more generally for everyone. It's that they can't conceptualize it because their thinking is so ingrained in these particular processes, or they're just tired,
Or they've seen one come along every year.
Yeah, exactly. And, and then there is a very small percentage of that type of teacher that you and I were talking about earlier, who I don't think exists as much these days, but, that type of teacher who is in it for power and control and to be able to dominate. And, so they're not going to change even when you do sort of change the processes, but they probably will find I'm not getting what I need within this system. I'm not getting that power. And I'm not being able to dominate and have power over. Yep. So I'll find a different place to get that. And they leave.
If you give students agency, that's a problem for that type of teacher, right? So with that, we kind of more than filled an hour. This was really fun, really interesting.
It was fun for me too. Thanks, Howard.
So hang on a second. We're going to roll the credits and then you and I just chat for a second. So very much. For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.